Okay, so moving on to connective tissue. Connective tissue is going to be the most abundant type of tissue we have actually in our body because it provides some huge roles. So, for example, binding and support is underneath every single epithelial tissue layer that we have because it's going to help protect, insulate, store, reserve fuel, and transporting substances. Because if we look at our four main classes of connective tissue down here at the bottom, we can see this is probably going to be the most abundant tissue because our blood makes it up, our bones, our skeletal system as well, the cartilage, and connective tissue proper, which again lies underneath all epithelial tissue. So this is a really good table to kind of go in and break everything down. It'll also help you with your lab exam. So if you look at the type of cells, if we're talking about connective tissue proper in general, it's going to be fibroblasts or fibroblast are going to be your main cell. We are going to have chondroblast or chondrocytes in our cartilage. That's what chondro means, is cartilage. And then when we look at bone, it's going to be osteo. That means bone, blast, and osteocytes. And then the blood, which you were already tested on your first lab exam, is going to have our erythrocytes or red blood cells, our leukocytes or white blood cells, and then our platelets, which are going to help with blood clotting. So if you want to go in and take a look at this table, it breaks down the four main classes, the types of cells that they have as well. So we're talking about connective tissue. They have two things in common. So they all arise and have the same common embryonic origin, meaning they all arise from mesenchyme tissue. They're also going to have cells that are suspended in some sort of matrix, and that matrix is called the extracellular matrix. So those are two things that they both always have. What's going to differ between the types of connective tissue is the vascularity. So for example, that means blood supply. Our cartilage is avascular, so it has zero blood supply at all. There's no blood vessels in our cartilage. But when we talk about bone, which is another class of our connective tissue, it has huge amounts of vascularization. So huge blood supply is actually in our bones themselves. So again, in common, they all arise from mesenchymal tissue. They're all going to have cells that are suspended or embedded in some sort of extracellular matrix. What the difference between them all is how much blood supply do they have. It can vary from having no blood supply to having huge amounts of blood supply. So let's go back to the three main elements. So they're all going to have the ground substance, and they're all going to have fibers. There's three types of fibers that we're going to talk about. The ground substance and the fibers together, that's what makes up the extracellular matrix. Which is also abbreviated ECM, if you ever see that in my slides. The cells, again, it's going to vary on which main class we're talking about. If we're talking about connective tissue proper, it's typically fibroblasts or fibrocytes. Unless we're talking about adipose tissue, then it's adipocytes. And then so if we're talking about cartilage, it's going to be chondroblasts or chondrocytes. If we're talking about blood, erythrocytes, leukocytes, and platelets. And if we're talking about bone, it's going to be osteocytes or osteoblasts. So let's talk a little bit more about one of the main elements of connective tissue, which is the ground substance. And it's really just an unstructured gel-like material, kind of like the cytoplasm that's in the cells itself. But this ground substance is actually going to be residing between the cells, and it's going to be the thing that contains the fibers. It's going to be the medium through which the solids are going to be able to diffuse from the blood and into the cells themselves. So what actually makes up the ground substance? We have some fluid, so interstitial fluid. That just means fluid that's between the tissues or the cells themselves. There's going to be some cell adhesion proteins, and these are going to act to connect the connective tissue cells to the extracellular matrix. We also have proteoglycans. So we see proteo, that means protein. Glycans means some carbohydrate or sugar. So these are really just sugar proteins that are also going to be there. There's also going to be a lot of water that can be trapped. It's going to be in varying amounts. So, for example, that's going to be based off of our hydration status of our body. So, if we're dehydrated, we're not going to have a lot of water trapped there. If we're heavily hydrated, we'd have more water there. And the amount of water is going to affect the viscosity of the ground substance. And viscosity just means like the stickiness or the flow. So water has a low viscosity because it's not very sticky and it flows very easily, where something like oil would be more viscous because it's more resistant to flow. So now we can talk a little bit about the fibers that are present. Collagen is going to be the strongest and most abundant type. You'll see that osseous tissue or our bones have huge amounts of collagen fibers. Why do we have a lot of collagen fibers in our connective tissue? Because they're normally bundled together to form thicker fibers. And these are going to be really strong and help provide tensile strength to whatever tissue that they're in. Elastic fibers are different. They're not really for strength. They're more for elasticity because they contain elastin. And elastin is just a protein, and the protein's rubber-like. So it allows things or tissues to stretch and then recoil back to shape. So there's a lot of elastic fibers in our aorta, which we'll see in a little bit, because it's subject to such high pressure when our ventricles contract in our heart that it has to be able to stretch and then resume or recoil back to its original shape. Then we have some reticular fibers. These are really only abundant in reticular tissue, and these are very short, highly branched collagenous fibers, but they're not the same type of component that is in collagen fibers. Really, it's just branching networks, and if we have these branching fibers within, it's going to allow for that tissue to have more give. So let's talk a little bit about the suffix for cells. So when we mention the cells that were prominent in each of the four main classes of tissue, they typically have two different terms. So we can use like a chondrocyte or chondroblast. Well, what does that suffix mean? Well, if we're talking about blast, that's always going to be the immature form of the cell. And then if we're talking about cyte, that is the actual mature form of the cell. So they all start out as blasts. So if we're talking about a fibroblast, that's how all of the cells begin. It's the immature form. It's going to be the one that's actually secreting things or doing things. The cyte's going to be the mature form that's going to help maintain the tissue once it's already developed. So if we're talking about fibroblasts, that's going to be in the main class of connective tissue proper. Chondroblast is going to be in cartilage. Chondro means cartilage. Osteo means bone, so that's going to be the immature bone cell found in bone or osseous tissue. Also in bone, we're going to have hematopoietic stem cells, which we'll talk a lot more when we hit to the skeletal system. Again, eventually all of these blasts, the fibroblasts, chondroblasts, and osteoblasts, are going to mature into the cyte form. So then we have fibrocytes, chondrocytes, and osteocytes, and they're not going to be as active because their whole purpose is just to help maintain what is already built in the tissues. We can also talk a little bit about cells. So I did say connective tissue proper, the main cell is a fibrocyte or a fibroblast, with the exception of one, because one of our specific types of connective tissue proper is adipose tissue. And for adipose tissue, it's not secreted or made by fibrocytes. Instead, it consists of adipocytes. So adipose tissue means fat tissue. So we're talking about adipocytes. These are the cells. And if you look at adipose tissue under the microscope, it literally looks like bubbles. And then because it's full of lipids or fats, and it has a squished nucleus typically towards the circumference of the cell. So this is kind of what adipose tissue looks like there. Bunch of bubbles. And their function is really just to store energy as fat. We have our white blood cells. These are also called leukocytes. So I would make sure, like especially on a lab exam, that you understand white blood cells need to be called leukocytes. We have 5 different types of white blood cells or leukocytes, but when we're talking about connective tissue, only 3 of the 5 are typically found there. So those are our neutrophils, eosinophils, and our lymphocytes. And the white blood cell function is really just to help with foreign microbes, really, or alerting our immune system. So if we have some sort of injury to our tissue, they're going to be activated so they can alert the immune system that we might have some foreign invaders in the place. Mast cells, these are going to initiate inflammatory response, so they release a bunch of inflammatory chemicals, one of which is histamine. So if you have huge amounts of inflammation, you have huge amounts of histamine in your body being released from these mast cells, which is why you want to take an antihistamine when you have an allergic reaction. And they release histamine, or these inflammatory chemicals, based off of the presence of different microorganisms. So if we have fungi or bacteria in our body, that would stimulate the mast cells to release the inflammatory chemicals. And then we also have in our connective tissue macrophages floating around. And these are phagocytic cells that are just going to come in and basically ingest and degrade all of the foreign debris, anything from dead cells to microorganisms to malfunctioned organelles, anything. They just come in and eat it, digest it, and break it all down. So this is an example, and the best example where we have tissue that we can prominently see all of these types of cells and these fibers and the different substances is areolar connective tissue. So this is like a cartoon image of areolar. Because in areolar connective tissue, you can see all 3 fibers prominently. We can see the ground substance, or this jelly-like fluid in the back. Collectively, our fibers and our ground substance make up our extracellular matrix. We can see that we do have some blood supply in here. And then we can see our different cells. So we do have some adipose cells or adipocytes in here floating around, or the fat droplets. Mast cells, which are going to release the inflammatory chemicals. Neutrophil, which is a type of leukocyte or white blood cell. And we can see the fibroblasts, because we're talking about connective tissue proper. That's the main cell type. We also have some macrophages that can be found, and another type of leukocyte, which is a lymphocyte.